The first warning did not arrive with artillery. It arrived as a number. A German intelligence officer in Berlin looked down at a production report from the United States and decided at first that someone had made a mistake. The ship totals were wrong. The bomber totals were wrong. The tank totals were so absurd they looked like propaganda, because Germany had spent years studying America, and they believed they understood us. Not as soldiers, not as a warrior people, not as a nation built for sacrifice. They saw a country of salesmen, mechanics, farmers, clerks, and factory hands. A loud, comfortable republic across an ocean. A country that talked big, made money, and avoided the hard disciplines of Europe. And in one sense, their mistake was easy to understand. In 1941, the German army had crushed Poland, shattered France, and driven deep into the Soviet Union. Its officers had been raised inside a military tradition that treated war almost like a priesthood. America, by comparison, looked unfinished. Our army was expanding, but still green. Our tanks were ordinary. Our officers had more classroom time than battlefield time. Many of our soldiers had never heard a shot fired in anger. So, when Pearl Harbor pulled the United States fully into the war, German planners did the calculation that made sense to them. America might become dangerous eventually. But eventually was too late. They believed Russia would collapse first. They believed Britain could still be strangled. They believed the Atlantic Ocean would buy Germany the time it needed. And then the numbers began to move. The American war did not start like a parade. It started like a shift change. Shipyards that had been quiet came alive. Auto plants became tank plants. Typewriter companies made weapons parts. Refrigerator factories made aircraft components. A civilian economy began turning, not gradually but violently, into a war machine. And German analysts had no category for what they were watching. Liberty ships were being built in sections and welded together like giant steel furniture. A ship that once took months to complete could now appear in weeks, then faster again. One Liberty ship, the Robert E. Peary, became famous because it went from keel laying to launch in just over 4 days. To a Navy fighting a tonnage war that was not just impressive, that was terrifying. Because German submarines were still sinking Allied shipping. Their U-boats were still killing men in the Atlantic. But the old logic had cracked. If America could put ships into the water faster than Germany could send them to the bottom, then the U-boats were not winning a campaign anymore. They were falling behind a factory, and the factory did not panic. Then came the aircraft reports. At Willow Run in Michigan, Ford built a bomber plant so large that men said you could almost lose the horizon inside it. B-24 Liberators rolled through that plant with the logic of an assembly line, not a workshop. To German officers, this was almost insulting. Weapons were supposed to be crafted. A tank, a gun, a fighter plane. These were instruments of skill and precision. America treated them like problems of volume. Build it, standardize it, ship it, replace it, build another one. That was the American grammar of war. And nowhere was it clearer than the M4 Sherman tank. The Sherman was not the most glamorous tank in the world. It was not a Panther. It was not a Tiger. It did not make German engineers bow their heads in admiration. But it could be built by the tens of thousands. It could be repaired with standardized parts. It could be shipped across oceans. It could arrive with fuel, ammunition, radios, mechanics, spare engines, and another Sherman behind it. That was the part Germany underestimated. They were not just facing American weapons. They were facing an American system. Still, the German High Command held onto one last belief. Machines do not fight wars. Men do. And on that point, early 1943 seemed to prove them right. In Tunisia, at Kasserine Pass, green American troops ran into hardened German veterans. The result was ugly. Units broke. Commanders lost control. Vehicles were abandoned. Equipment was captured in embarrassing quantities. German soldiers walked through the wreckage and saw exactly what they expected to see: a rich country with poor soldiers, a factory army, a paper army, a people with equipment but without the hard nerve to use it. And, for a moment, even some Americans feared the same thing. But Kasserine was not the verdict. It was the lesson. The United States Army did something that far older military institutions often found impossible. It admitted it had failed. It removed commanders. It changed procedures. It tightened training. It fixed coordination. It learned in public, under fire, and at speed. That was the first battlefield surprise. Not that Americans never made mistakes. They made plenty. The surprise was how fast they converted mistakes into doctrine. By the time American forces pushed through Sicily and Italy, German officers could feel the change. The Americans were still not German in style. They were not elegant. They were not romantic. They did not worship the clean tactical duel. But they were becoming brutally competent. And then came Normandy. On June 6, 1944, the German commanders facing the Channel expected an invasion. They did not expect a floating city. More than 5,000 ships crowded the water. Landing craft, destroyers, cruisers, supply vessels, hospital ships, minesweepers, transports. It was not merely an attack. It was a moving industrial civilization. But the invasion fleet, huge as it was still only the opening statement. The real shock came after the beachhead survived. It came in the hedgerows. The Normandy countryside was a defender's dream. Ancient earthen banks, thick hedges, narrow lanes, small fields that turned every few hundred yards into a separate battle. A German machine gun team could disappear behind a wall of green and hold up an entire American platoon. A German officer expected the Americans to solve that problem the traditional way. Push men forward. Outflank if possible. Assault if necessary. Pay for the ground in blood. But the Americans used a different equation. A young lieutenant, sometimes barely older than the men he led, got on the radio. First came mortars. If that did not work, battalion guns. If that did not work, divisional artillery. If the position still lived, fighter bombers came down out of the clouds. And if the coastline was close enough, naval gunfire reached inland and tore the hedge apart with shells fired from ships the Germans could not even see. To the German mind, it looked wasteful. It looked clumsy. Some called it cowardice. But then they counted the dead and understood the harder truth. It worked. The Americans were not refusing to fight. They were refusing to fight on Germany's terms. Germany had spent generations perfecting the art of doing more with less. America had brought an answer Germany could not copy. Do more with more. Much more. That difference was not just tactical, it was spiritual. German logistics was built around sufficiency. Calculate what is necessary. Move it efficiently. Do not waste. American logistics was built around abundance. Assume the plan will change. Assume the road will break. Assume the weather will turn. Assume somebody will need more ammunition than the table says. Then send enough so the shortage never happens. German officers who captured American supply dumps reported scenes that sounded almost insane. Mountains of artillery shells, rows of fuel drums, crates of rations, stacks of tires, boxes of boots, engines in storage, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, medical supplies, rain covers, radio parts, not hidden, not sacred, not counted like jewels, just sitting there waiting to be used. To the German army, that looked like criminal waste. To the American army, it was the point. A unit that never ran dry could keep attacking. A battery that did not fear tomorrow's shell count could fire today. A tank crew with spare parts could return to the line. A rifle company with hot food and dry socks could keep moving. War had always punished friction. America began burying friction under inventory, and that leads to the detail that broke the German military imagination more than almost anything else. Trucks, not tanks. Trucks. The German army that had invented blitzkrieg still depended, in huge numbers, on horses. Behind the panzer spearheads were wagons, animals, exhausted infantry, and supply columns that belonged partly to another century. The American army landed with a different assumption. Everything moves. Men moved by truck. Food moved by truck. Fuel moved by truck. Bullets moved by truck. Engineers, radios, field kitchens, medical units, spare parts, bridging equipment, all of it moved on wheels. A German division ordered to shift 100 miles might march for days and arrive tired, hungry, and scattered. An American division could load up, drive through the night, and appear at the new front still carrying its firepower with it. That did not make every American decision brilliant. It made American mistakes survivable. It made American pressure continuous. It meant that when a gap opened, Americans could pour through it before the German staff had finished understanding where the gap was. That truth came violently into focus in July 1944. Operation Cobra. For weeks, the fighting in Normandy had been slow and costly. Then the Americans concentrated air power and artillery on a narrow section of the German line. The bombing was so heavy that parts of the defense simply ceased to function. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite formations, was smashed into confusion and ruin. And through that wound came the American breakout. Armored columns did not stop to duel every strong point. They bypassed, they cut roads, they hit headquarters, they forced German commanders to solve 6 emergencies at once. The war in France became motion, and the Germans could not move the same way. When their panzers tried to gather for counterattack, Allied aircraft found them on the roads. When staff officers tried to establish a new line, American units were already turning the flank. When orders went out, fuel did not arrive. When fuel arrived, the road was gone. When the road opened, the bridge had been hit. When the bridge was repaired, American armor was behind them. German reports from the front began to sound less like battle updates and more like autopsies. They still praised German discipline. They still insisted their men fought well. And often they were right. German soldiers in 1944 could still defend a village with lethal skill. They could still ambush a column. They could still punish careless troops. They could still win a hill. But every local success cost Germany something it could not replace. Every burned American tank was replaced. Every lost American truck was replaced. Every fired American shell had another shell behind it. Every damaged unit was pulled back, refilled, rearmed, and sent forward again. Germany could win moments. America was winning the arithmetic. The clearest proof came after the breakout during the Great Pursuit across France. The railways were shattered. Ports were not yet fully usable. The front was racing away from the beaches. By every old rule of war, the advance should have strangled itself. Instead, the Americans created the Red Ball Express, a one-way highway system, round-the-clock truck convoys, thousands of vehicles running fuel, food, and ammunition forward day and night. Many of those trucks were driven by Black American soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps, men fighting Jim Crow in uniform while keeping the Allied advance alive. Their work was not glamorous. It was not the image on the recruiting poster. But without those drivers, tanks stopped. Artillery stopped. Infantry stopped. With them, the front kept moving. German commanders would choose a river line and assume they had time. The Americans would appear the next morning with engineers, boats, bridging gear, bulldozers, radios, traffic control, and enough gasoline to turn a pause into a crossing. It felt, to the Germans, like fighting a nation that had negotiated new terms with distance. And by autumn, the older German generals understood the meaning. This was not just a temporary imbalance. This was not just a matter of courage. This was not something one brilliant maneuver could repair. Germany had built a magnificent sword. America had built a forge that never cooled. Still, Hitler tried one final throw of the dice. December 1944, the Ardennes. Snow, fog, frozen roads, thin American lines. A surprise offensive through the forest. The same broad idea that had humiliated France in 1940. At first, it worked. German armor tore into the line. American units were overrun. Thousands were captured. Road junctions became desperate. Fear moved faster than orders. And at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne and other American troops were surrounded. The German plan depended on collapse. It depended on shock. It depended on the Americans reacting like an army, without deep habits, without nerve, without the ability to reorganize under pressure. But surrounded men did not become broken men. They held, cold, short on supplies, under shell fire, cut off. When asked to surrender, the answer that came back was one word: nuts. And while Bastogne held, the American machine turned. Patton's Third Army, positioned far to the south and preparing for a different attack, wheeled north with astonishing speed. A whole army changed direction in winter. Trucks moved, fuel moved, maps changed. Traffic control shifted. Columns rolled through ice and snow. The Germans had planned for surprise. They had not planned for an enemy that could absorb surprise, reroute an army, and keep the supply system breathing while it did it. Then the weather cleared. The Allied air forces returned. German columns that had moved under the protection of cloud were exposed. Fuel trucks were hit. Roads were strafed. Armored spearheads that had advanced boldly began to stop, not because every tank had been destroyed, but because the fuel was gone. And when Germany spent its last great reserve in the Ardennes, those losses were final. A destroyed German division was a grave. A battered American division was a repair order. That was the final lesson. Not that American soldiers were superhuman. They were not. They were frightened, tired, cold, wounded, angry, homesick men who wanted the war to end. The difference was that ordinary American men were standing inside an extraordinary national machine. A machine that fed them, moved them, armed them, replaced them, connected them by radio, covered them with artillery, protected them with air power, and kept pushing them forward until the enemy's skill no longer mattered enough. By 1945, Germany was sending boys and old men to defend the ruins. The American army was still arriving with fresh divisions, fresh trucks, fresh tanks, fresh ammunition, and bridges already planned for rivers not yet reached. The Rhine was supposed to be Germany's last great barrier, a river loaded with history, myth, and military meaning. The Americans treated it like a logistics problem. Artillery, smoke, boats, engineers, pontoon bridges, traffic lanes, fuel points, medical evacuation, another crossing, another road, another push. That is when the German illusion finally died completely. They had believed America was soft because America was commercial. They had believed a nation of civilians could not become a nation of soldiers. But they misunderstood the connection. The factories, the roads, the assembly lines, the repair depots, the standardized parts, the radios, the trucks, the clerks, the mechanics, the welders, the drivers, the men who knew how to organize production and keep a system moving. That was not separate from American power. That was American power. Germany had prepared to fight an army. What it found was a factory with a front line. And once that factory reached Europe, it did not need to win every duel. It only had to keep running.